Hey, everybody, welcome on in. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. As is tradition with our webinars, we typically start them like 1 or 2 minutes after the posted start time. You know how it is with Zoom events where everyone gets a buzz from their phone and then they have to rush to their device and maybe Zoom needs to update. So we give everyone a minute or two of grace. So hang around and we will get started around 7:01, 7:02. Hey, Tori, how's it going?
Oh, what's
Sorry, I'm upping
going on? How are you?
AirPods. Very good. It's an exciting day when PSAT scores come back. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, already got some good news from some students who qualified for national merit. Very exciting.
Yay.
Yeah,
I suppose it was probably the same good news, but I'm very excited about
yeah. This is a different one that came in over text. We'll talk later. Are
it.
you guys still having like unseasonably beautiful weather in Philadelphia?
Oh yes.
Lovely. All right. Cue up the slides here. If you just got here, we're going to get started in a minute or two. We like to give people a little time to filter in at the beginning of the presentation. One thing I will just say now is please, please, please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom at any point during this presentation. We have, an agenda and some slides to get through for what we think is most important, but you're all going to have your own questions, and that's great. So at any point you'd like to, please drop your questions in the Q&A, and we'll also get the chat turned on so that you can message us there as well if that's easier for you. And it looks like the clock has struck 7:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome on in, everyone, to our webinar on planning for a spring SAT or ACT, now that many of you have PSAT scores. So we're really excited to present, and by we, I mean myself, Jim Wismer. I'm the Director of IB Experience. I see many familiar names in our attendee list here, so welcome to all of you who do know me. And to those of you who don't, the main hat that I wear here at IB Experience is that I help families form their test prep plans. I'm joined by Tori Burke, our Assistant Director and Specialist in Accommodations. So if your student qualifies for extended time on testing or anything like that, Tori's someone who can help you with that process, and also helps me to kind of oversee all of our test prep tutoring here at IB Experience. So welcome on in, Tori.
Hello.
Um, Now, any conversation about standardized testing in college admissions needs to start with the fact that grades and academic rigor are the most important factors in a student's academic journey. So, what I mean by that is that you can think of a student's academic record on a college application as their transcript that shows their grades and academic rigor and standardized test scores. And there are other things that may come into play, but those are the two main factors. And of those two, the grades and academic rigor, they show the student's academic achievement over a very long time period. And so that makes them more valuable in many ways than the snapshot performance of a standardized test because it's showing that a student, consistently shows up and hands their work in on time and is prepared for class, things that colleges want to know about a student, right? But the standardized test score is very important because it shows, on an apples to apples comparison to students all across the country, what that student is capable of academically in that specific measured realm. So, as an analogy, if we have any football fans here, I like to call the transcript, the grades and academic rigor, they're analogous to a draft prospect college game film. It's what they did over the whole course of their career, right? It's easy to see a lot of really good information from that, but their combine results, their testing in the 40-yard dash and the bench press and the vertical leap and things like that, that's more of what standardized testing is. It's, when we ask you to perform to the best of your ability on one specific day, how do you show up to the task? And so I mention this just so that everyone kind of keeps the main thing the main thing. Keeping an excellent performance with your grades is very important. With that said, if you tuned into our most recent webinar, you would have heard us talking a lot about grade inflation. And I'm not going to talk about it too much today. I know we have many people who were at the last one, but I do just want to make sure, parents, that you understand the difference in what grades mean now and what they've meant in the past. What I have here is a graph showing the percentage of freshmen at US four-year colleges that have at least an A minus average. So that would be at least a 90% or at least a 3.0 in a traditional 4.0 scale. And that percentage has gone from 21% in the 60s to over 85% as of last year, which is the last complete data set we have. So I mention that because grades don't mean the same thing now as they did when you parents were in high school or periods before that. I like to point out the example of the University of Pittsburgh. It's one of our flagship state schools in Pennsylvania, which is where Ivy Experience was founded and where many of our students are from. And it's a popular school with students out of state as well. And at the University of Pittsburgh, they use a weighted GPA, but over 60, I think it's 67% of their students have a GPA of over 4.0 in a weighted scale. And the average GPA of their applicants is over 4.0. So that means that standardized testing really stands out to colleges as something that is, in fact, standardized. Uh, when we say that it's standardized, the scores mean the same thing year over year. So we have here the average ACT score each year since 1990. We're using ACT, not SAT, because SAT has changed their scoring scale and redesigned their test several times over that period, whereas ACT has stayed consistent until this spring. More on that in a moment. But if you zoom in on this ACT trend a little bit, actually, in more recent years, scores have trended down. And this has held up with our anecdotal experience working with students. It was really hard for students to properly learn math during the pandemic. And, you know, students had different situations, different amounts of help at home, different amounts of virtual school. But by and large, it caused gaps in students' education that we're seeing in standardized testing data. And so we're in an environment where almost every college is test optional still, but colleges really do value the data that testing gives them. With
So,
that, go ahead, Tori.
so you might be wondering, so what overall is the point of all of this? So the number one important thing here is to predict the student success at college. So colleges are really trying when they accept students into their school to be predicting how basically the chance that they're going to graduate. And one of the things that they use standardized testing for is to predict the freshman GPA, as well as their likely retention rate. So overall, colleges are trying to predict three things, which is college freshman GPA, four-year grad rate, and retention rate. And standardized testing has been shown to be actually the most important indicator of that freshman GPA. So that's actually more important than their GPA in high school. So that's just something that is a really helpful indicator for colleges in terms of like, will that student actually be successful here? It's also a really helpful way to compare with your local context. So what that means, and this is something that sometimes I think parents don't necessarily know, is that when your student applies to a college, your college is not only just getting that application that you received, they're also getting something called the school profile, which is attached to your transcript, which shows the high school's average SAT score and average ACT score, as well as some other important things about the school. So that means that a really high score might mean something different at depending on which high school you went to. So a student that went to in objectively like less a successful high school and they got a 1400 when maybe the average at that high school is like an 1000 or something, that student would be maybe that might be weighted a little bit better than a school where you like the average might be like a 1350 or something. The overall score is still really, really important. So a high score is a high score is a high score. But it is also something that they can sort of directly compare apples to apples when the schools are not all apples, some of them are oranges, as we like to say. So it's also part of just the holistic review process. which means when used or required, they're one factor, but they're absolutely not the whole picture. So, speaking of when they are used and required, we have sort of the three possible ways that they might be asking for tests or not asking for tests. So, most well-known colleges and universities right now are test optional. And what test optional means is really different depending on the school, and that's something that we'll be talking about in a moment. But the two ones that are easy to understand are test required and test blind or score free. So, test required is just what it sounds like, which means the test must be submitted in order to be considered for application. Um, Not for applications, to be considered for admittance. And the University of Georgia is one such school, as well as the whole Florida state system. MIT has gone this way, Georgetown is this way. And we're sort of seeing a slow return to more and more, especially really high caliber schools going test required. There was kind of a whole slew of like a domino effect. Basically, MIT did it first, and then everybody else was like clamoring to make their statement one way or the other. And then there are also a lot of schools, or comparatively fewer, frankly, than sort of more similar to how many are test required, that are test blind or completely score free. So the most important and largest system that is like this are all of the UC schools or the University of California schools, as well as the Cal State program. So those are the two public ones in California, the two types of public schools in California.
So one thing about test optional that Tori alluded to on the previous slide is that test optional really means different things at different schools. So test optional, what it really means is you can apply with or without a test score. It doesn't say anything about your likelihood of success with or without a test score. So the essentially you have a college that's test optional like Duke or Penn. They're admitting over 70% of their class with scores. And so the students who are being admitted without scores are typically going to be some kind of institutional priority, students that the university, really wants to prioritize being able to admit. The most obvious type would be like a quarterback for the football team, right? Then you have schools that are test optional, but they're admitting fewer than 30% of their students with test scores. University of Washington and Pepperdine would be examples of this. They are test optional, but they are kind of only admitting students with test scores as an exception. Most of their applicants are not submitting test scores, and they don't see it as a big, important thing for a student to have to be a successful applicant to their school. That doesn't mean that a strong test score can't help you there, because a strong test score can always help you. It just means that in certain situations, schools won't value it as much as others. And so the bottom line with test optional, before we move on to the true topic at hand here, is that a strong score is always going to be an admissions asset. What a strong score is going to vary school to school. We actually did a webinar on test optional admissions a little while ago. So on our YouTube page, you can find that recording and kind of get a more detailed explanation of what I mean by that. But the more selective your college goals are, the more important it is to have a score. That's because, one, as Tori mentioned to us, the most selective schools are going to tend to be the schools most likely to require scores. And two, even at the schools that are highly selective and test optional, the majority of their students are submitting scores. Schools like Duke and Penn that are test optional, but mostly admitting students with test scores. A strong score is always going to expand your options, both for school choice, in the sense that you get and apply to test required schools and have a better chance at schools that highly prefer scores. And then merit scholarships, where one of our examples for an extremely test optional school, Pepperdine, they require test scores for their highest level of scholarship. So you could even be admitted test optional somewhere, but be helped by your test score on the financial side of things. So the last thing I want to add about test optional, and this is a conversation that we have with many families around PSAT time, is if the time and energy and money it would take to get your score to the point where it's useful to you is just not worthwhile, if it's costing your students time that they should be spending on their coursework, or they're having to drop an extracurricular activity that's really, really important to them and will help in college admissions, then that's when you start to consider, okay, maybe I should be planning to go test optional in the first place. That case is definitely more of an exception than the rule. But you'll notice that in my screen here, I have a QR code to set up a 15-minute call with me. And we do 15-minute planning calls with anyone. So please feel free to set up a meeting if you think your student might be interested in just going test optional from the beginning. We can talk through what it's actually going to mean for them based on what their goals and situation are at this point, and talk about it then.
So, in terms of determining an SAT or ACT timeline for someone that is definitely going to take a test, um, what we like to recommend for most students would be a first test in junior year, either on a fall or a spring timeline. However, we really pride ourselves on our advising. You are not your neighbor, and your child is not your neighbor's child. Um, Even for students where you feel like you know them really well, this is like a best friend, something like that. That student is probably going to have some mitigating factor that is going to change when there maybe a September versus an October exam, that kind of thing. That can be really specific for your student, and we're more than happy to discuss that with you. In terms of most important sort of overarching things, though, having Algebra 2 or geometry completed is very important. So Algebra 2 and geometry are definitely the backbone of both the ACT and the SAT math sections, and having those completed really does help quite a lot. So even if you aren't going to have those completed by the end of junior year, so say, or by the end of sophomore year, so say you're in Algebra 2 as a junior or even perhaps geometry, we do have students every year that start with us a little bit sooner, and we just prep just the verbal section rather than the math for those students. So it's good to get a good head start on that kind of thing. And then you're getting that math as you go. And we can start with the math maybe in March when you've got a little bit more of the material. Something else that's really important is that extracurricular and the real life schedule. So that might look like, okay, I'm in the spring musical. I really want to be done with my testing before that starts, or perhaps I want to get started after that starts. You might have a fall sport or a winter sport, and you might want to avoid having the big three things. So sports or musical or whatever that big extracurricular is at the same time as school, at the same time as test prep. We do have students every year that prep through their musicals, through their sports, um, through their AP schedule, whatever it might be. However, we do try to avoid that when it's possible, which is a really big advantage of trying to get that schedule set before, so you can try to have as many options open to you as possible in terms of starting timeline. And then the final and perhaps even one of the most important things is that mental health piece. So again, we really are trying to decrease stress rather than increase stress. And that mental health piece is really important. So that a lot of times is going to look like trying to avoid that big AP season with May, which is an option for some of the tests. So we're try to avoid as much stress as we possibly can, again, which is why it's good to kind of give yourself as many options as possible in terms of start time by getting an early start in terms of having the discussion.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I know we have a combined audience of 10th and 11th grade families here, but 10th graders, it's for the vast majority of you, it's too early to do test prep, but it's never too early to have the conversation about when the right time is going to be. Because the more intention and thought you put into that, the easier your life is going to be next year during what's for most students the busiest year of high school. Now, in terms of dates, as we have the timeline conversation here, I want to just highlight two dates in particular for both tests, and that is the date that is last accepted for early action and early decision deadlines with colleges, and the date that is last accepted for regular deadlines for college. In red, we have the dates. This is, by the way, senior year fall. So, senior year fall semester, the December test date is going to be the last one that's accepted for a college's regular deadlines. Those deadlines tend to be like December 31st or January 1st. And so you can take the test through December. Early action and early decision deadlines, most of them are November 1st, but they span from October 15th to November 15th. And the October SAT or September ACT are typically the last dates possible. And this is more of a consideration at this point for our juniors who are coming to this and just starting to put together plans to test this spring. Because when you're putting your plan together for which test dates to target this spring, you just want to know kind of when do I need to be done by? And the answers are here for SAT and ACT respectively. Most of our students will apply to at least, a few schools early. We're not going to get into early action versus early decision here, but certainly you can tune into others of our webinars or send us an email and we can explain it to you. But basically, these are the dates by which you want to have things wrapped up.
So, whenever we have a conversation about test dates, probably our most common myth that perpetuates every single year, no matter how many times anyone sort of tries to tell people that this is not the case, is, well, I don't want to take that September test date because I've heard from my neighbor's boyfriend's mother's cousin that that's the hardest test date and my kid will be in a world of trouble. And it turns out this is just simply not true. So, the way that these curves work is that they are predicted ahead of time. And whatever happens on test day has nothing to do with how that curve works. So, they do have harder and easier curves, which are based on how hard and easy those predicted curves are, basically, and how easy and hard the actual test is. But they occur completely randomly throughout the year, and there is no way to predict where they will be. We can show our work for you if you'd like, but those easier and harder curves truly happen randomly. And no matter how many people tell you that this is not the case, we promise that this is the case. So don't be trying to make any sort of 4D chess moves with where you're trying to have the most easy curve, because that's not a good way to decide what test date to take and which test date to avoid.
And an extra confounding factor in that is the fact that individual variation can often be more significant than an easier or harder curve writ large. Because you may, for instance, really struggle with a particular math topic that could show up anywhere from 2 to 4 times on the test.
Mhm.
Well, if it shows up only twice, you're going to have an easier time than if it shows up 4 times, right? So that the tests are not perfectly consistent with the distribution of exactly what's on the test on a given day. And a lot of individual variation will come into play with just, did you actually enjoy the topics of some of the reading passages? That's a big benefit, right? Did they just make your eyes instantly glaze over? It's going to be harder to do well. And that is going to vary person to person. We work with students where a passage about automobile manufacturing history gets them super excited, right? The future engineers of the world. And then other students for whom that is a total chore to read. So the individual variation can come into play too, which is just another reason to not try to game the system with when you take it from an ease of curve standpoint. So now we want to just get into kind of what the difference is between the SAT and ACT, since we've been alluding to both tests. So the digital SAT is essentially a test with 4 sections, 2 reading and writing and 2 math. And then each of those gives you a score out of 800. So 800 in math, 800 in reading and writing. Relative to the ACT, what we typically hear from students are the biggest challenges are the limited annotation tools. So by annotating, we mean on the ACT, it's a paper test still. You can write wherever you want on that test. The digital SAT has some actually really great annotation tools if you know how to use them, but you're never going to have the freedom of a pencil and a piece of paper where you can do whatever you want to that test. The verbal questions on the SAT, most students will report that they're more challenging. The passages can include things like poetry or English from the 1800s. The ACT is all going to be prose from like the, second half of the 1900s on. So it's all very familiar language to our students relative to what they might see on an SAT. And then finally, the SAT is adaptive. And what do we mean by that? So essentially, a student's performance in section one of reading and writing or math will feed them into either an easier second section or a harder second section based on their performance in the first. And then that dictates your range of possible outcomes in terms of score. There is overlap between what you can do with a really good performance in the easier second module or really poor performance in the harder second module. So it doesn't like cut you off from a specific score, but it does limit your score range. So essentially, we call it a challenge for students. It is a mental challenge, purely mental, because the fact that this test is adaptive shouldn't really change anything about the way students take it, logically speaking. Parents have asked me, like, well, how do you coach around that? The best way to get a better score on the SAT is to answer more questions, right? So we coach students to answer more questions, right? It is not a good idea to try to tank your way into the easier second module because you'll do really well in it. Because at the end of the day, all you've done is locked in a wrong answer for the prayer of maybe getting some more right answers. Not a good gamble. And you don't know how many you've gotten right or wrong to that point because you don't know anything about it. So the answer is you should just try your best on every question and get more questions right. If you want to know how that happens, then book a call with me up there. So, when we talk about using a PSAT score and what it actually does for a student, it serves as an initial benchmark for what a student could expect to score on the SAT. Often, I would say students have a disconnect between their perceived difficulty of the PSAT and what their score was. And a lot of that is because of the adaptive nature of the test. The essentially, if you felt that the test was easy, that's because you most likely tested into the easier second module. And that means that likely your score is going to be on the lower end. Whereas if you felt that that second module really kicked your butt, well, then that means you probably tested into the harder version. So hopefully you did well in it. But often students' kind of self perception of how the PSAT went can be off in a way. We always recommend that students take a diagnostic ACT to compare their results because you want to find which test is likely to give you better results, and all colleges accept both of those two tests equally.
So, you probably have heard a couple of things about the major changes that are coming to the ACT. And the ACT does tend to change a little bit more gradually than the SAT, which is something that I think is kind of a benefit to it. Which, and in this case, that is still happening here with these big changes. So the ACT will have a digital option, and that digital option is coming in April. Although they will not be necessarily as broadly available, we think until probably about September. The paper option will still be available to everyone into perpetuity, as far as we're aware. The ACT has made a guarantee that that's going to be true forever. Who knows about forever? Nothing is guaranteed. But at least for anybody that's in this presentation, you'll probably have the option to take a paper test as long as you want to. The science section is going to become optional. And I use these scare quotes very on purpose because no college has actually said they don't want to see that science section. So still take the science section is what we're saying for right now, and probably what we will be saying for the near and probably even medium term future. And one thing that we know for sure is that the science section will still be required for some important scholarships. What we have here on the slide is the Bright Future Scholarship, which is probably the most important scholarship in the state of Florida. So definitely still be taking the science section for sure if you live in Florida. But other places too, we would really recommend taking that until we've got really firm confirmation from colleges that not only is it not optional, but they don't want it. So that's what's basically happened with the writing section, which you may have heard of if you took the test a while back. If you're a parent, definitely you probably had to take that writing section, which is like a short essay. That went from being required for everyone to optional, but still preferred for many colleges to now being sort of not wanted by pretty much anybody at all. The science section, we don't know if it'll go that way. It may or may not. But what will definitely be happening is that the test will be shorter overall, and there will be significantly more time per question for the new version of the test. And that's a guarantee that'll be happening for all students, whether they take the digital version or the paper version. So timing depending on grade. So 10th graders, this is easy for you guys. All ACTs or junior year will be in the new version, whether that's the shorter paper version or the shorter digital version. The 11th graders are the people that need to be thinking about this a little bit more carefully. So the current ACT format will be available through July. So what we're recommending right now is that anybody that's currently thinking they're going to be done by then should definitely be just assuming that they should just take the paper version in its current form, bing, bang, boom, done. You're going to be forced into that new version. So either that paper new version, which is that shorter version of the new digital test, but it'll still be on paper, regular style. You'll still be able to take that science section. It'll just be that shorter version with fewer questions, starting next September. Or you can take that test on the computer in September as well. So basically, juniors were more than happy to sort of game out with you whether or not you want to be taking which, maybe you want to try a digital version. But unfortunately, the diagnostic for that is not yet available, so you wouldn't quite be able to figure that out for a little bit. So this is sort of a little bit what I was just saying before. The classic ACT, which is what we have right now, is the English, the math, the reading, and the science section with an optional writing section. And that optional writing section, we don't currently recommend that anybody take that. The only school that for a while was requiring it was West Point, and now they don't even want it anymore. So currently, just kind of a waste of time to take that. The new version of the test will be the core, which is the English, math, and reading, which are still going to be required, with two optional sections, a science and a rating section, which again, we won't be recommending people take the writing section, but we will be recommending for the near and medium future that people be taking that science section. And then all of these new core versions will be a shorter version of that test with fewer questions, but they just will be those still required.
So, you're probably wondering why we just spent so much time talking about the ACT during a PSAT webinar. And it's because, just to reiterate, we really believe that everyone should be trying both the SAT and a version of the ACT before making a decision about which of these two tests to focus on. So 11th graders, we recommend for you to take a diagnostic in the current paper version of the ACT. We can provide one. We will send it out to the attendees of this webinar tomorrow. For you 10th graders, we recommend waiting until ACT makes a sample test available in the new format. And so we're hoping that they do that by this spring. Really, a good kind of way to think about diagnostic testing 10th graders is you want to have it done by spring break, because that way you'll be able to pick out your test dates for the coming year and all that heading into the summer. You already know your plan. So if you plan to do test prep over the summer, you know exactly what test date you're aiming for and all of that. And it's helpful, even if you're on the later timeline, to just know sooner when you're going to be getting going. When it comes to taking these diagnostics, often one score will be much stronger than the other, and that will just tell the story. You know, if you are basically starting with a 100-point SAT equivalent head start on one of the two tests, just take it and run. Very straightforward decision. But for a lot of our students, the scores will be relatively close. And that's when we look and essentially help families decide which one is going to give us better results in the long run based on where the areas of improvement are going to be and how we tend to see students improve in those areas. And so we do a free diagnostic evaluation for any student. So if you send us an ACT and an SAT score or a PSAT score, or if you need us to send you the practice test, you do them at home and then just send us back your results. Then we grade it, we compare the two tests, and we give our recommendation based on what we're seeing. At that point, we offer a planning call to talk through the results, test dates, and all that good stuff. So all of that is free. We don't charge for any of those services. So if you have any friends or neighbors who are still trying to figure this all out, we're always happy to talk to them about it. And after that, of course, you can do test prep with us. Now, when it comes to the diagnostic testing, we really want to, I just realized that I said all of this on the previous slide without clicking to it. So we'll probably just skip right past this one. Um, and instead talk about, again, timelines. So juniors, you should really be taking diagnostic testing as soon as possible. Sophomores by the end of the school year, but spring break is just such a good time to do it because you actually have the time off from school. Freshmen, don't be prioritizing diagnostic testing yet. You want to take it when you're closer to the time you're actually going to do your test prep. So that usually means sophomore year at the earliest.
So another one of these really typical questions that we get all the time is, well, why shouldn't my kid just take both tests? And the answer is you can do that if you really want to for some reason, but there's not really a great reason to do this. So the tests do test approximately the same type of content. It's murky, but it's pretty much the same stuff. However, there are enough differences that it makes a little bit more sense to focus your prep on one test or the other test. So you're really, really getting the most sort of sucking the marrow out of that prep experience. So that might look like, especially for the two tests as they exist right now, the timing strategies are very different. And having the students get those like really specific and targeted timing strategies, content strategies for the things that are a little bit different, all that stuff really winds up, we really see a very big difference between students that just prep for one thing versus they try to spread themselves a little bit too thin. However, there are off the court benefits. So if you prep for one test, you're going to be getting a large benefit for the other exam. It's more just wanting to sort of target things as much as we can for the tests where it makes the most sense. So in terms of who should take both tests, those are people that are really aiming for the absolute highest scores. So that might look like somebody who's going to get perfect score on the test on one day where there's no matrix determinant question, and there is that matrix determinant question and they forget it. In that case, it's better to just sort of give yourself as many chances at the dartboard as you possibly can, just to see what Jim was talking about before, which is, oh, I just have a preference for one type of material versus the other. Oh, I got that automobile engineering question that I wanted. Great, I'm going to do better on this test this day. For most people, that's not really as much of a consideration because that like 1 point difference isn't going to make as much of a difference for someone that's going for a 1290 versus someone that's going for a 1550. But, again, we're more than happy to talk through those specific circumstances with you and your child. So, in terms of SAT and ACT registration, that's pretty straightforward. We're going to be sending these slides out to everyone that's registered today, and you can just register at one of these two links. You want to be entering your zip code to see the local options, and there are just a few important checkboxes. One of them is much less important than the other one. So, the first one of these is the optional information, which is just marketing lists that are sold to the colleges. This doesn't really matter very much, so you can do it if you really want to be able to get as many options as possible. I actually found out about the college that I wound up going to based on like a random brochure I got in the mail because of my PSAT score, which is Bryn Mawr College. I went to school, I grew up in New Hampshire. I went to school here in Pennsylvania. Nobody knew about Bryn Mawr. So that was great for me. But some people don't really need that information or don't want it, and it's just kind of a lot of litter for them. So check the box or don't. It's really just a personal preference. The one that is not a personal preference is the opting in to having your scores sent to colleges automatically. Do not do this ever because you get a migraine in the middle of the test, you get a nosebleed, you bleed all over your Scantron. We don't know if any of this stuff is going to happen. And unless you
Yeah, the
cancel the score
marching
that
band's
day,
practicing out the window. You have the dreaded
yes,
sniffer in your
yes,
test room, the kid with the cold that just distracts you the whole time. You cannot
yes,
control what happens, so
no,
you shouldn't just automatically send the scores.
no. When I took the SAT, for example, a fire alarm went off in the middle 4 times. And I'm quite glad that I did not have that particular test sent to the college. But yes, so basically the first optional checkbox, truly optional. Sometimes it can be kind of a nice confidence boost that you're getting a nice brochure from Northeastern, for example, which you almost certainly will receive no matter what score you get. Just not to do a little shade towards Northeastern, but that's a nice little confidence boost, or you might just not want it, and that really depends on the student. So we do also offer a lot of resources for students with accommodations, and that's kind of my area of expertise, which is nice. We have a blog post explaining what the ACT and SAT accommodations process looks like, which is sort of a more general overview of that process and what those accommodations are. And I'm also really happy to answer any questions you might have on the phone. And again, that is one of our free services that we offer. So just feel free to call me, and I'm more than happy to walk you through what accommodations you might be eligible for depending on what 504 or IEP you have at school, and just basically talk through whatever possible circumstance you might have, and also talk about neuropsych testing, all of that kind of thing. So the fundamentals of SAT and ACT prep look vaguely similar for all people. And what that really, the most important thing is to practice in authentic testing conditions. So especially for students that are sort of coming up in this post-COVID era, they're not as used to taking these long timed exams. There's more and more of these sort of more low stakes assessments being offered in school where they get to retake them. They're taking them willy-nilly one day, next day, whatever. This test is not like that. Obviously, you have to take it all at once. You have to take it in a timed environment. That kind of practice is vital for everyone, whether or not you're practicing, whether you're prepping with us or prepping with somebody else. And also, that also looks like this all at once with a 10-minute snack break. If you're taking it with a 45-minute break in the middle, you are not taking in authentic circumstances. And that is a lovely free piece of advice we are offering. No matter who you're prepping with, absolutely you should be taking the test all at once with that 10-minute break. We're also, what we can offer as well is to identify and target these areas of personal need. So almost everybody needs to be taking these full length exams. Not everybody needs to be practicing that matrix determinant question that I talked about earlier. We're more than happy to really identify those specific areas for you, and the tutors are really experts at that. So that's something that we love to do. Also, and again, this is for everybody, being really consistent with this practice. Doing one test 6 months before your test and then expecting that exact same thing is going to happen on test day is silly, frankly. Don't do that. We want consistent practice that happens either every week or every other week is really vital to knowing how you're actually going to do on test day and getting a really high quality result. So The worst part of all of this, arguably, depending on if you're the parent or the student, probably, is waiting for the score. So for the SAT, it's very consistent for the most part, which is that school scores are released the second Friday after your test. That's pretty much true every time. For the ACT, the scores are a little bit more annoying in terms of how they come out. The scores begin to be released the second Tuesday after your test, but they can take 6 weeks to be released, which is kind of annoying. Students with extended time accommodations, specifically when they're using something other than what's called the national extended time, which is a time and a half that happens all in one day, those students probably will get their score at the same time as everyone else. Students that are taking their test over multiple days or over multiple weekends will almost certainly have their test scores delayed or at least received a little bit later. And again, that's something that I'm more than happy to talk about with you on the phone. Another test question we get asked all the time is about superscoring. So, what is superscoring? Superscoring allows you to combine your very best section across different test days to have the ultimate super score. So that might look like, okay, one day I go in, I'm feeling great about my English and I'm feeling great about my science in the ACT sec. I'm bookending my day. I'm having a great beginning and great end. In the middle, I'm feeling kind of blasé, not doing so well on reading, not doing so well on science. I come out of it, maybe I get a 34 on the first section, a 34 on the last section, and 29s in the middle, which would be kind of an atypical distribution, but that is something that I saw recently on a real test. And the next time we go in, we prep really hard for our middle two sections on our reading and our math. Oh, I got them all mixed up. That's okay. I meant English and science, but that's okay. So the next time we go in and we really prep for those middle two sections, so that math and our reading, and we come in the next time and we knock it out of the park. We get 34s on those middle two and we get 29s on our ending ones. So overall, we've actually really improved our score. So we might think that our score is all the same because we had a 34 and two 29s and a 34 at the end, and then at the end, the other time we had 34s in the middle and 29s on the end. Well, in fact, what we've done is raise our score by 3 points because overall we now have a 34 overall, which is great news. So sometimes students feel a little not so good about their overall improvement if it doesn't technically improve one test to the next test, but that can be actually like a really massive deal. So that's something that we really can help you do in terms of prepping for a retake. That prep will usually look quite different than it did for the first attempt at the test because we're really going to be prepping for specific areas to be maximizing that super score. Not all schools do super score. So an important example of this is Penn State for some people that are in this webinar, but Georgetown is probably the most well-known school that does not super score. That's kind of annoying. But more than half of well-known colleges do, and I think at this point it's probably significantly more than half of colleges do super score. And a question that I get very often that I'll head off right now is that people are always asking me if the ACT also super scores. Yes. I think that there are some schools that only super score for one or the other, which we're more than happy again to talk with you through on the phone, but it's very few schools. And yeah, again, unless they're on your list, you don't really need to be worrying about that.
Great. So then the last thing for us to just touch on in a webinar like this is AP scores, because we know that many students will be taking APs possibly for the first time this spring. The primary point of AP scores is college credit or college placement. So you can, use your AP US History 5 on the AP exam to potentially get credit, for an introductory US History course at college. That is the point of the program. have increasing importance in admissions. So the dean of Emory recently came out last spring and said that they're less trusting of GPA than they have been in the past because the data we showed you earlier. And so they are actually relying on AP scores more than ever to validate a student's grades. So AP scores used to be a very minor factor in the admissions process, but we've seen them start to rise in importance over the years. I will say that we've heard from many colleges that AP scores are more significant for students when no SAT or ACT score is on the application. So the term test optional, when you opt to apply test optional, just means you're not sending the SAT or ACT. You still can and often are encouraged to send AP scores. And in fact, the University of California does consider AP scores in their admissions decisions, even though they don't consider at all the SAT or ACT. And so the tests will be offered in May, and you just want to make sure you go into that with like a strong timeline for when you're going to take it and when you're going to prepare. So thanks everybody for joining. We'll stick around for as long as you have questions. So please drop them in the chat or the Q&A. We had one question come in already. If you take both the SAT and the ACT, if you opt to report your score for one of the tests, will both SAT and ACT tests be reported? The answer to that is a resounding no. You get to choose what you share with colleges. Your scores are protected by privacy law. So if you take the SAT and the ACT and you're really happy with your ACT score and you're unhappy with your SAT score, no college ever needs to know that you touched an SAT. They will you unless you send it to them, they won't know. And this is, to reiterate Tori's point from earlier, another reason never to opt to have your scores sent automatically. It costs like $15 a school to send them later, and it is worth the $15 to have control over what colleges can and can't see in this process. All right. Then I believe that's it for questions. Um, okay, we did just get another one that came in. Uh, is there a formula by which to translate the PSAT score into an estimated SAT score? The answer is no, and that it's really actually for most students a one-to-one correspondence. In other words, your PSAT score is what you would expect to score on an SAT. And the reason for that, the PSAT is only scored out of 1520, not out of 1600. And so you would think that that means that, oh, you just add 80 points to the score and then you get your SAT score. The thing is that the only 80 points that are missing from the scoring scale of the PSAT is the top 80 points. So if you score a 1520, it's possible that you could have gotten up to a 1600. But because the PSAT's questions are a little easier, because it's designed only for early year juniors, not for juniors and seniors, like the SAT, the questions are on a lower level. And that means that they don't have the questions that allow a student to prove that their score should be higher than a 1520 on the SAT. So you can't just add that 80 points if your score is a 1060, because the missing 80 points have nothing to do with the 1060. They're just missing from the highest difficulty level questions. So the test scores are kind of inflated and deflated at the same time on the PSAT, deflated by the missing 80 points and inflated by the fact that the questions are actually easier. And that means that, they're roughly accurate. They're not going to be exactly precise. But frankly, the SAT isn't an exactly precise instrument, because a student can take the test on 2 consecutive days and score, 50 points apart. That's fairly common. So it's a matter of, take it for what it is as a rough benchmark for how you would do on an SAT, but there is no magical formula for taking the PSAT and turning it into an SAT score. Great question, though. One other question. Can you opt to have only one of your SAT scores sent in if you happen to take multiple tests and one of those tests is the strongest? The answer is often yes, but not always. And there is something that College Board offers to colleges called score choice. Score choice, if a college participates in score choice, it means that you in fact can just choose what score to share with colleges. So if you're happy with your March SAT but not your May, you just send March. They never know about May. But if a college does not participate in score choice, then that means that College Board in their online interface only gives you the option to send all scores to that school. So there are schools out there that will require you to send every score if you want to send one. But it is more common for the college to opt for score choice and for you to have that level of control. If you're sending a super score, typically they're only sending the scores that are relevant to the super score. Another small point on this, colleges can see the lower scores from all test dates that comprise the super score. And that's an important point because you can't hide a bad performance. Now, colleges aren't trying to ding you if you, score 1 point lower on the English this time because you were only prepping for, math and science, right? That is not so much of a problem. The issue comes when students think that they can sleep through the English section because they already locked it up, and they will see the 11 that you get from random guessing. So you can't just totally mail it in. It's okay if you don't do quite as well as the first time, but those scores are available to colleges. So you want to still put your best foot forward in every section. Plus, even if you're happy with your English score on the right day, you can still improve it. So you should just take the opportunity. You already woke up that early on a Saturday, you're already there. You might as well give it a shot and see what you could do. Awesome. Thank you all so much for attending. Really appreciate it. Feel free to book a meeting with us or reach out, via our email, phone number. We can text. So if you have a quick question and that's the best way, feel free to reach out that way as well. Hope you all have a great night. Bye bye.